What would you do if your wife of 22 years handed you divorce papers on a Tuesday morning while you were still in your bathrobe, holding a cup of coffee that hadn't even cooled down yet? That's exactly what happened to me. And until that morning, I genuinely believed my life was solid. Not perfect, nobody's is, but solid. The kind of solid you build over 2 decades of showing up, of paying bills on time, of never missing a single one of my daughter's school plays or saw her games. The kind of solid that's supposed to mean something. Apparently, it didn't mean enough. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I was 51 years old, standing in my own kitchen, watching my wife of 22 years slide a manila envelope across the granite countertop like she was handing me a utility bill. She didn't cry. She didn't even look particularly sad. She looked like someone who had already made peace with a decision a long time ago and was only now getting around to informing the other party. "I need you to sign these," she said. I looked at the envelope. I looked at her. I set my coffee down. "What is this?" "Divorce papers." She said it the way you'd say the mail's here. Flat. Practiced. I asked her why. I think every person in that situation asks why, even when some part of them already suspects the answer won't be good enough. She told me she felt like she lost herself, that she'd spent her entire adult life being somebody's wife, somebody's mother, and she needed to find out who she was outside of all that. She used words like journey and growth and rediscovering. She said she loved me but wasn't in love with me. She said she hoped I'd understand someday. I didn't sign anything that morning. I put the envelope in the kitchen drawer and went to work like a man walking through water. My wife, I'll call her Diane, and I had met in our late 20s at a company conference in Atlanta. She was in marketing, I was in logistics, and we spent the entire second evening of that conference talking on a hotel terrace until 2 in the morning. We got married 18 months later. We bought a house in Raleigh, North Carolina. We had our daughter, Claire, when Diane was 32. For a long time, it was a good life. A real one. But marriages drift sometimes, and I suppose ours had been drifting for longer than I wanted to admit. Diane had grown quieter over the years, more distant. She started spending weekends at a pottery studio downtown, then yoga retreats, then weekend trips with girlfriends I barely knew. I told myself it was healthy. I told myself she was just exploring interests. I was wrong about what she was exploring. For 3 weeks after she gave me those papers, I slept on the couch in my own house. I kept hoping she'd change her mind. I kept thinking that 22 years had to count for something. That one morning she'd come downstairs and tell me she'd made a terrible mistake. She never did. She was polite. She was even kind, in the way that people are kind when they've already emotionally checked out and feel guilty about it. She made dinner some nights. She asked how work was. She was treating me like a house guest she felt sorry for. I finally signed the papers on a Friday evening in November, sitting alone at the kitchen table with a pen that kept running out of ink. It took me 3 pens to get through the whole thing. Diane moved out 2 weeks later. She rented an apartment on the other side of Raleigh, something modern with big windows and exposed brick, the kind of place that says fresh start in every square foot. I stayed in the house because of Claire, who was 19 at the time and home from her first year of community college. Claire didn't say much about any of it. She hugged me more than usual, and she started leaving leftovers in the fridge with little notes that said things like, "Made extra, don't skip dinner, Dad." My daughter was taking care of me. That was one of the harder parts to swallow. The first few months after Diane left, I functioned on autopilot. I went to work, I came home, I mowed the lawn on Saturdays, I watched too much television and ate too much takeout and told myself I was fine when my coworkers asked. I was not fine. I was the walking definition of a man who didn't know what to do with himself, now that the life he'd planned was gone. It was Claire who eventually dragged me back into the world. She signed me up for a home renovation workshop at the local hardware store. One of those Saturday morning classes where they teach you to tile a backsplash or fix a leaky faucet. She said the house needed work and I needed a project. She was right on both counts. I went to the first class mostly to get her off my back. And then I went back the next week, because it turned out I actually enjoyed it. There's something grounding about working with your hands, about a problem that has a clear solution and a visible result. I started with the backsplash in the kitchen. Then I repainted the living room. Then I tore up the old carpet in the hallway and put down hardwood. About 4 months after Diane left, in early spring, I hired someone to help me with the backyard. The fence had rotted in several places, the deck needed refinishing, and there was a section of garden beds that had been completely overtaken by weeds. I'd gotten a referral from my neighbor for a small landscaping and odd job service, 2 people who did quality work at reasonable rates. One of those 2 people was Diane's younger sister, Melissa. I want to be clear about how that felt when she pulled up in a pickup truck on a Saturday morning with work gloves already on her hands. My stomach dropped about 6 floors. Melissa was 4 years younger than Diane, and while the 2 of them had the same dark hair and sharp eyes, they were different in almost every other way. Diane had always been polished, controlled. Melissa had never quite fit that mold. She'd moved around a lot in her 30s, Portland, Denver, Asheville, doing various kinds of outdoor and trade work. Diane used to describe her sister's life with a kind of veiled pity that I now recognized as something else entirely. I almost told Melissa to leave. I stood there on my porch for a good 10 seconds trying to figure out what the appropriate thing to do was. "I know," she said before I could say anything. "This is weird. I can go if you want." I looked at the rotted fence. I looked at the garden beds that had become genuinely embarrassing. "How long will the fence take?" I asked. 2 days, maybe 3 if we hit any surprises." "Fine," I said. "Let's just keep it professional." She nodded. "Let's just keep it professional." She nodded. "That's all I'm here for." And that was true for a long time. Melissa and her partner, a quiet guy named Darnell, came 3 weekends in a row and worked on the yard. They were efficient and thorough. Melissa didn't bring up Diane. I didn't either. We talked about the fence posts and the deck stain and whether the garden beds would benefit from raised borders. It was the most normal I'd felt in months. On the 3rd weekend, Darnell had a family thing and Melissa came alone. We worked alongside each other most of the morning. Me sanding the deck, her finishing the last garden border. Around noon, I went inside to make sandwiches because it seemed rude not to. She sat at the picnic table on the freshly finished deck and we ate lunch without saying much. Then she said, "For what it's worth, I think she was wrong to do it the way she did." I didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "She could have talked to me," I said. "Years of talking could have happened." Melissa nodded slowly. "That's not really Diane's way. You probably know that." I did know that. I'd spent 22 years watching Diane decide things internally and announce them after the fact. I just never expected to be on the receiving end of something this large. "How long did she know?" I asked. I wasn't even sure why I asked it. Melissa was quiet for a moment. I think she'd been unhappy for a while. I don't know the specifics. There was something in the way she said "I don't know the specifics" that made me feel like she knew more than the specifics she was choosing to share. I didn't push it. We started having coffee after morning work sessions. Not every time. Maybe once every 2 or 3 weekends. She'd come back inside after loading up the truck and I'd pour 2 cups and we'd sit at the kitchen table for 20 minutes before she left. We talked about her work, about the different cities she'd lived in, about what had eventually brought her back to Raleigh after years away. She'd come back to be closer to their mother, who was getting older and needed more support. Diane, for all her talk about family, had not relocated an inch. I didn't tell Claire about any of this for a long time because I didn't know what this was. It was coffee. It was 2 people in a strange situation being decent to each other. It didn't feel like anything that required a conversation. Then came the afternoon in June, when I came home to find a car I didn't recognize in my driveway, and Claire sitting on the front step with her arms wrapped around her knees and an expression on her face that I hadn't seen since she was 12 years old, and her grandmother had died. I sat down next to her. "What happened?" She didn't answer for a moment. Then she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not be angry at me." My stomach did the 6th floor drop again. "Okay," I said. "I've known something for a while," Claire said. "Since last year, since before Mom gave you the papers." I waited. "She wasn't just finding herself, Dad." Claire's voice was very steady, the way voices get when someone has practiced saying something difficult out loud alone before saying it to another person. There had been someone for at least 8 months before she asked for the divorce. I sat with that for a long moment. "Who?" I asked. She told me. It was a man Diane had met through the pottery studio. A sculptor, 10 years younger than her, who apparently validated everything Diane felt she'd been missing. Claire had found out, because Diane, in a moment of what I can only assume was either carelessness or unconscious guilt, had left her phone unlocked on the kitchen counter while Claire was visiting her new apartment. Claire had seen a message thread she wasn't meant to see. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. Not angry, genuinely asking. Because you are already so broken, she said quietly. And because I don't know what I thought, that it would make it worse, that you'd fight the divorce harder and just hurt more. I'm sorry, Dad. I've been carrying this for months and I'm so sorry. I put my arm around my daughter and told her it wasn't her fault and that I wasn't angry. Both of those things were true. I was a lot of things in that moment, but angry at Claire was not one of them. What I felt about Diane was harder to name. Not shock, the news reorganized things, but it didn't shatter any illusion I'd been consciously holding. More like the dull, heavy feeling of having a suspicion confirmed after you'd almost convinced yourself it wasn't true. 22 years. And she hadn't even given me the honesty of a real reason. She'd handed me finding herself like it was a complete answer. I called my lawyer the next morning, not to undo the divorce. It was already final by then, but because I suddenly felt like reviewing exactly what I had and hadn't agreed to in those papers. My lawyer told me everything was standard, that I'd actually come out reasonably in the settlement given the circumstances. I hadn't paid much attention during the process because I'd been in a fog. I was grateful then that my lawyer had been paying attention for me. I didn't call Diane. I didn't confront her. I made a decision somewhere in the days after Claire told me the truth that I was not going to spend whatever energy I had left on that chapter. It was done. Let it be done. What I did instead was call Melissa. Not to tell her what I knew. Not to make it complicated. I called her because I had a section of fence in the backyard that had started to lean again after the rain, and she was the person I trusted to help me fix things. She came that Saturday. We fixed the fence. We had coffee afterward. Can I ask you something? I said. Sure. Did you know about him? The sculptor? She set her cup down carefully. I found out about 6 months ago. She told me. I told her she needed to come clean with you. She didn't agree. And you didn't tell me either. No. She met my eyes. I didn't think it was my place, and I was trying to figure out what my place even was. You're her ex-husband. I'm her sister. This whole situation is... She searched for the word. Complicated, I offered. That's one word for it. We sat with that for a while. Outside, the yard looked genuinely good now. Better than it had in years. Maybe better than it had ever looked. The garden beds had actual flowers in them. The deck was solid and clean. Melissa had made something out of neglect. And somehow that felt like a metaphor I wasn't ready to examine too closely. I told her I wasn't angry with her. I told her that I understood why she hadn't said anything and that I didn't blame her for protecting her own complicated position in all of this. I appreciate that, she said. I also want to keep having coffee, I said. If that's not too strange. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, It's a little strange. I know. But I don't think strange is necessarily bad. We started spending time together with some intention after that. Not rushing anything. Neither of us was in a hurry. We went to a farmer's market one Sunday in July. We took a drive out to Jordan Lake one afternoon and sat by the water and talked for 3 hours. She met Claire formally for the first time since the divorce, which was its own kind of awkward, and Claire was quiet about it for about a week before she told me she thought Melissa was nothing like her mother, and she meant that as a compliment. I fell in love with Melissa slowly, the way you fall asleep, gradually and then all at once. It was different from the first time. The first time with Diane had been bright and urgent, the way everything is in your late 20s when you're convinced that intensity equals permanence. This was quieter, more certain, like recognizing something you've been looking for without knowing you were looking. Melissa was honest in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. She said what she meant. She didn't perform. She'd had her own difficult years. A relationship in Denver that had ended badly, a period of real financial struggle, the long process of figuring out what she actually wanted from her life versus what she thought she was supposed to want. She wasn't somebody who'd had things handed to her. She was somebody who'd built things, slowly, with her hands. By fall, she had a key to my house. By the following spring, she'd moved in. Claire took us all out to dinner the night Melissa officially moved in. Her idea, her treat. She made a toast that was mostly directed at me. Something about how she'd spent a year worried about whether I was going to be okay and she could finally stop worrying. I had to look at the ceiling for a moment. Melissa squeezed my hand under the table. None of this means the road was clean. It wasn't. There were conversations with Diane that were necessary and unpleasant. When she found out about Melissa and me, and she found out because Claire told her directly, because Claire had decided she was done managing information for other people. Diane's response was not graceful. She called me. She was not calm. She said things that I won't repeat, that mixed genuine hurt with what I recognized as the specific fury of someone who wanted to be the one who moved on, and instead found that someone else had gotten there first. She called Melissa too, apparently. Melissa handled it without drama. She told me about the call afterward without omitting anything and without editorializing much. She's angry, Melissa said. She'll probably be angry for a while. That's all right. Then she went back to whatever she was cooking, and that was the extent of the discussion. I later heard through Claire that the sculptor, the one Diane had left her marriage for, the one she'd been exchanging messages with for the better part of a year while still living in our house, had ended things with Diane about 3 months after the divorce was finalized. Apparently, the reality of dating a newly divorced woman in her late 40s was less romantic than the clandestine version had been. Apparently, he had moved on to someone who didn't come with the emotional weight of a dissolved 22-year marriage. I want to say I felt nothing when I heard that. I want to say I was completely past it. Honestly, I felt something small and not particularly noble. A brief, involuntary there it is. Then it was gone. I didn't dwell on it. It wasn't mine to dwell on it. It wasn't mine to dwell on anymore. What was mine was the life I was actually living. Melissa and I got married on a Saturday in October at a small venue outside of Raleigh, an old farmhouse with a wide porch and an oak tree that had been there long enough that the roots had lifted one corner of the driveway pavement. 26 people. Claire stood next to me. Darnell, Melissa's old work partner, drove up from Charlotte to be there. Our mothers sat in the front row. I was 53 years old. I wore a navy suit that Claire had helped me pick out. When Melissa came around the corner of the farmhouse in a simple ivory dress, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers she'd arranged herself that morning, I understood something that I hadn't had the vocabulary for before. That starting over isn't a consolation prize. That what comes after the loss isn't necessarily less than what came before. That sometimes the life you build in the wreckage turns out to be the one that actually fits. I'm not writing this to make Diane a villain. She made choices that hurt people, including herself. But she is, in the end, just a person who made those choices. I stopped needing her to have been a monster in order for my own story to make sense. What I know is this. I was a man who had coffee in his bathrobe on a Tuesday morning and had everything rearranged without warning. I spent months not knowing which way was forward. I fixed a fence. I had coffee with someone who told me the truth. I built something new slowly with someone who knew how to build. The backyard looks incredible, by the way. Melissa added a vegetable garden last spring along the south fence. Claire comes over on Sundays sometimes, and we sit on the deck that we finished together 3 years ago and eat whatever came out of the garden that week. And don't talk about anything important. And everything is exactly as ordinary and as extraordinary as that. I thought I had my life figured out. It turned out I hadn't even started.